What if a queen's love letter could topple a king? What if a secret relationship hidden for decades changed the course of an empire? And what if the history you were taught deliberately left out the most human parts of a monarch's story, all to protect a crown's reputation? These women were not just rulers. They were people with hearts, desires, and secrets. Secrets that others in power worked very hard to bury forever. Number 23. Did a doctor's prescription include ruling a country? A German doctor ended up the de facto ruler of Denmark. A king was so unstable that he signed away his own power, often without realizing it. A queen's affair led directly to a palace coup, her imprisonment and her lover's downfall. This is the story of Caroline Matilda. She was a British princess, the sister of King George III. At just 15, she was married off to her cousin, King Christian VII of Denmark, in 1766. It was a disaster from the start. Christian was mentally ill. He suffered from severe paranoia and erratic behavior, making a real marriage impossible. Caroline was isolated, young, and miserable in a foreign court. Then came Johann Friedrich Struensee. He was a German doctor hired in 1768 to manage the king's deteriorating mental state. Struensee was intelligent, charismatic, and a man of the Enlightenment. He believed in reason, reform, and progress. He quickly gained the trust of the unstable king. But he also caught the eye of the lonely queen. Caroline and Struensee started as friends. He was someone she could talk to. They shared ideas. He treated her with a respect she never received from her husband. Their intellectual connection grew into a deep emotional bond. Soon, they were inseparable. As the king's condition worsened, he came to rely on Struensee completely. He would sign any document the doctor put in front of him. This gave Struensee immense power. Between 1770 and 1772, he effectively ruled Denmark. He passed over 1,000 laws in a short time. He abolished censorship, reformed the courts, and tried to improve life for the common people. He was a radical, and the conservative Danish nobility hated him for it. They saw him as a foreign usurper, and they saw his relationship with the queen. By this point, the affair was an open secret at court. When Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Princess Louise Augusta, in 1771, it was widely believed that Struensee was the father. The couple grew bold, even careless. They acted like the true rulers of Denmark, which, in a way, they were. But their power was built on the signature of a sick king. The nobility, led by the king's stepmother, Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, saw their chance. In the early hours of January 17th, 1772, they staged a coup. They woke the king, convinced him his life was in danger, and had him sign arrest warrants for both Struensee and Queen Caroline. Caroline was arrested and taken to Kronborg Castle. Struensee was thrown into a prison cell. Their affair was used as the primary weapon against them. It was proof of their moral corruption and their treasonous intent. Struensee was put on trial, and under pressure, he confessed to the affair. His confession sealed both their fates. He was condemned to death. Caroline's marriage was dissolved. She was exiled from Denmark, forced to leave her children behind. She would never see them again. She was sent to live in Celle, a small town in her brother's German territory of Hanover. She died there just 3 years later, at the age of 23, from an illness. History, written by the victors, painted Caroline as a foolish, immoral queen who conspired with her lover to take power. Struensee was depicted as a wicked, power-hungry foreigner. Their progressive reforms were quickly undone. For centuries, their story was told as a cautionary tale of lust and treason. The human element of a lonely young woman finding a connection in a miserable political marriage was buried. The love story was reduced to a criminal act, a convenient excuse to remove a political threat and restore the old order. The affair wasn't just a secret, it was the weapon used to destroy them and erase their brief, radical time in power. Number 22. Could a queen's best friend be more than a friend? She was called the Virgin Queen, a monarch who never married. Her letters to her closest female friend were so passionate they were later edited by her descendants. She dressed in men's clothing and abdicated her throne rather than be forced into a political marriage. Queen Christina of Sweden was one of the most unconventional rulers of the 17th century. She was the only child of the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus. When he died in battle in 1632, she became queen at the age of 6. She was raised like a prince, receiving a rigorous education in politics, philosophy, and languages. She was brilliant, stubborn, and utterly uninterested in the traditional roles of a queen. Her court was a hub of intellectual activity, and she invited scholars and artists from all over Europe, but her closest confidante was a woman. Her name was Ebba Spare. She was a beautiful and graceful noblewoman who served as Christina's lady-in-waiting. Christina was completely captivated by her. She called Ebba Belle and showered her with affection. In her letters, she referred to Ebba as her bedfellow and wrote things that went far beyond simple friendship. She told Ebba that she loved her more than anyone else and that her happiness depended on her. The nature of their relationship was a subject of gossip at court. It was an intensely close emotional and physical bond. They spent countless hours together, sharing secrets and dreams. For Christina, who resisted all pressure to marry a man and produce an heir, Ebba represented a kind of love and partnership that she could not find elsewhere. She wrote to Ebba, "If you do not forget me, I can be happy even if I never see you again. But if you forget me, I will surely die." This was not the language of casual friendship, but the pressure on Christina to marry and secure the succession was immense. She refused. She hated the idea of being subservient to a husband. She once said that she could not bear to be used by a man the way a farmer uses his field. In 1654, after 10 years of sole rule, she made a shocking decision. She decided to abdicate the throne. She named her cousin Charles as her heir and gave up her crown. One of the primary reasons she cited was her unwillingness to marry. After her abdication, Christina moved to Rome. She and Ebba were separated, though they continued to write. Ebba eventually married, a common fate for noble women of her time, which seemed to cause Christina some distress. Historians for centuries have tried to downplay this relationship. They described it as an intense schoolgirl crush or a romantic friendship, a common way to dismiss deep same-sex relationships from the past. When Christina's letters were published, they were often censored. Passages expressing her deep love for Ebba were removed to present a more proper image of the former queen. The erasure was a conscious effort to fit Christina into a conventional historical narrative. A queen who loved another woman, who gave up a throne for her personal freedom, was a difficult figure to explain. It was easier to focus on her intellectual pursuits or her conversion to Catholicism, another scandalous act for a Swedish monarch. But the letters remain. They show a side of the Virgin Queen that was anything but cold or unloving. They reveal a passionate heart, one that found its match not in a prince or a king, but in her beautiful friend Ebba Spar. Number 21, did a queen betray her country for a foreigner? She was the sister of the famous Marie Antoinette. She ruled Naples during a time of incredible turmoil, facing down the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. And she placed her trust, her kingdom, and her heart in the hands of an English commoner. Maria Carolina of Austria was a formidable woman. Married to the weak and disinterested King Ferdinand IV of Naples, she quickly became the true power behind the throne. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and determined to keep her kingdom independent. The French Revolution, which would eventually claim her sister's life, terrified her. She saw France as a mortal enemy. To help her fight against French influence, she needed a strong advisor. She found one in an unlikely place. Sir John Acton was an Englishman who had served in the Tuscan Navy. In 1778, he was recommended to Maria Carolina to reorganize the Neapolitan Navy. He was efficient, capable, and completely loyal to the Queen. She was impressed. She promoted him quickly. He became Minister of War, then Minister of Finance, and finally Prime Minister. He essentially ran the entire government of Naples. This gave a foreigner an unprecedented amount of power, which caused a great deal of resentment among the local nobility. But the Queen trusted him above all others. Their working relationship was incredibly close. They spent hours together every day discussing matters of state. Soon, rumors began to fly. People at court whispered that their relationship was more than just professional. The King Ferdinand didn't seem to care. He preferred hunting and games to ruling. He was happy to let his wife and Acton handle everything. The evidence for an affair is circumstantial but strong. They were a constant team. Maria Carolina's letters reveal a deep reliance on and affection for Acton. He was her partner in every sense of the word, politically and emotionally. He never married. His life was dedicated to serving his queen. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of European politics. They joined coalitions against France and tried to modernize their kingdom. But their power and their close bond made them many enemies. Opponents accused Acton of being a British spy, using the Queen to further England's interests. They accused the Queen of betraying her kingdom for her English lover. These accusations were powerful tools for their political rivals. When French forces invaded Naples in 1799, the royal family was forced to flee to Sicily. The affair, real or rumored, was used to paint the Queen as a corrupt ruler influenced by a foreign power. It helped justify the short-lived republic that was set up in their absence. After they were restored to power, Acton's influence began to wane. He was eventually dismissed in 1804 under pressure from the French. He died 2 years later. Maria Carolina was eventually exiled from her own kingdom and died in Austria in 1814. Historians often focus on Maria Carolina's political maneuvering, her fight against Napoleon, and her connection to Marie Antoinette. Her deep and decades-long partnership with John Acton is often treated as a political alliance. The personal dimension, the trust and affection that underpinned their joint rule, is frequently glossed over. It was easier to portray her as a purely political animal or as a weak woman swayed by a manipulative foreigner than to acknowledge the complex reality of a powerful queen who found her most trusted partner in a common man from another country. Number 20 was the Empress of Russia, controlled by a mystic. Her husband was the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the world's landmass. She was a German princess who became the last Empress of Russia. And her relationship with the peasant mystic was so scandalous it helped bring down a 300-year-old dynasty. Alexandra Feodorovna was the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. She was a deeply religious and shy woman who felt like an outsider in the glittering Russian court. Her life was defined by two things: her intense love for her husband and her desperate anxiety for her son. The heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. It was a terrible secret hidden from the Russian people. The slightest bump or cut could lead to excruciating pain and life-threatening bleeding. Doctors were helpless. Alexandra, consumed by guilt because she had passed the disease to her son, turned to mystics and faith healers. That is how Grigori Rasputin entered her life. He was a Siberian peasant, a wandering holy man with piercing eyes and a reputation for having healing powers. In 1905, he was introduced to the imperial family. During one of Alexei's bleeding episodes, Rasputin seemed to calm the boy and stop the bleeding. From that moment on, Alexandra believed he was a man of God, sent to save her son. Rasputin became a fixture in the palace. He was the only one who could comfort Alexandra and help Alexei. The Empress's devotion to him was absolute. She called him our friend and believed his advice came directly from God. This gave Rasputin enormous influence. He began to advise Alexandra on political matters. When Nicholas II went to the front lines to command the army during World War I, he left Alexandra in charge of the government. She, in turn, relied heavily on Rasputin's recommendations for appointing ministers. Incompetent and corrupt officials were hired and fired based on the mystic's whims. The Russian public and the nobility were horrified. Rumors about the nature of Alexandra and Rasputin's relationship spread like wildfire. They were accused of being lovers. Political cartoons depicted Rasputin as a puppet master, with the Tsar and Serena as his marionettes. The fact that Alexandra was German-born did not help. With Russia at war with Germany, many saw her as a spy, controlled by a degenerate peasant who was destroying the country from within. There is no credible evidence that Alexandra and Rasputin ever had a physical affair. Their relationship was based on her desperate faith and his ability to manipulate it. She saw him as a holy savior, a spiritual guide, but the perception of an affair was just as damaging as the real thing. The scandal eroded the last vestiges of public support for the monarchy. It made the imperial family look weak, corrupt, and foolish. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats, believing they were saving Russia, lured Rasputin to a palace and murdered him. But it was too late. The damage was done. Just a few months later, in March 1917, the Russian Revolution began. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty was over. The story of the affair was a key piece of propaganda used by revolutionaries. It was a simple, powerful story that explained the decay at the heart of the empire. Later, Soviet historians continued to push this narrative, portraying Alexandra as a hysterical and immoral woman whose illicit passions brought down a nation. The more complex truth of a terrified mother's desperate faith being exploited during a time of national crisis was less dramatic. The story of the affair, though likely false, was so powerful that it became an accepted part of the historical record, a convenient and scandalous explanation for the fall of an empire. Number 19. Did a queen's love affair bring down a king? She was the she-wolf of France, a French princess married to an English king. He was an exiled nobleman, her husband's sworn enemy. Together, their love affair and political ambition led to an invasion of England, the overthrow of a king, and a new chapter in the nation's history. Isabella of France was the daughter of King Philip IV. In 1308, she was married to King Edward II of England. She was beautiful and intelligent. He was handsome, but had little interest in his wife or in ruling. His attention was focused on his male favorites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. Edward showered his favorites with titles, land, and power, alienating the English barons and deeply humiliating his wife. Isabella endured it for years. She played the part of the loyal queen, producing an heir, the future Edward III. But she was sidelined, ignored, and her lands were even seized by the Despensers. She grew to hate her husband and his powerful favorites. Her chance for revenge came in 1325. She was sent to France to negotiate a treaty with her brother King Charles IV. Once there, she refused to come back. In Paris, she found a powerful ally, Roger Mortimer. He was an English baron who had led a failed rebellion against Edward II and the Despensers. He had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, but had made a daring escape and fled to France. He was a charismatic and ruthless military man. He and Isabella soon became lovers. They were united by their shared hatred of Edward and the Despensers. They began to plot. Isabella, using her royal connections, gathered support and raised an army. She declared that she would not return to England until the Despensers were removed from power. She presented herself as a wronged wife seeking justice. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion of England. They landed with a small force, but the English people, tired of Edward's misrule, flocked to their cause. The king's support collapsed. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his young son, Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer were now the de facto rulers of England, serving as regents for the young king. For about 3 years, they held absolute power. They were not subtle about their relationship. They lived and ruled as a couple, amassing wealth and land for themselves. But their reign was unpopular. Mortimer, in particular, was seen as arrogant and greedy. He became as hated as the Despensers had been. The young king, Edward III, was growing up. He resented being a puppet for his mother and her lover. In 1330, when he was 17, he staged a coup of his own. With a small group of loyal companions, he snuck into Nottingham Castle and arrested Mortimer. Mortimer was tried for treason and executed. Isabella was spared, but her power was broken. She was forced into a comfortable retirement, living out her days on her estates. Her affair with Mortimer was central to her story. It was the partnership that enabled her to overthrow her husband. But history has often struggled with how to portray her. She was either a heroic figure saving England from a terrible king, or a treacherous, adulterous woman who betrayed her husband and country for her own ambition. Later accounts, especially during the Victorian era, tried to downplay her agency and the love affair. They preferred to see her as a pawn of the ambitious Mortimer rather than his equal partner. They sanitized the story, embarrassed by a queen who led an army and took a lover to seize a throne. The raw reality of their passionate, power-hungry partnership was often erased in favor of a simpler, less messy narrative. But the truth is that their affair wasn't just a side story, it was the engine of a revolution. Number 18 was a queen exiled for loving the wrong man. She was the mother of Prince Albert, the man who would marry Queen Victoria and define an era. Her own life, however, was far from the strict moral code her son would later embody. Her love affair led to her being banished from her home and most cruelly separated from her children forever. Louise of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg was a lively and charming princess. In 1817, at age 16, she was married to the 33-year-old Ernest, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was a difficult man, known for his numerous affairs. The marriage was not a happy one, but it was a dynastic duty. Louise gave him two sons, Ernest the heir, and Albert, born in 1819. Louise was a devoted mother. She adored her two boys, especially the sensitive and intelligent Albert. But she was trapped in a miserable, loveless marriage. She was young, vibrant, and longed for affection. She found it with a man at her own court. Lieutenant Alexander von Honstein was a charming officer in her husband's regiment. You know, he was closer to her own age and offered her the kindness and attention her husband did not. They began a discreet affair. For a time, they managed to keep it a secret. But in a small German court, secrets were hard to keep. By 1824, Duke Ernest had found out. He was furious, not because he was a faithful husband himself, but because his wife's infidelity was a public humiliation and a threat to the legitimacy of his line. He immediately moved to separate Louise from her children. She was forced to leave the court at Coburg. She was just 24 years old. Her divorce was finalized in 1826. As part of the settlement, she was forbidden from ever seeing her sons again. This was the most devastating blow. She wrote heartbreaking letters to her young boys, but it's unclear if they ever received them. She was sent into exile, forced to live in a small town called St. Wendel. Alexander von Honstein joined her there, and they were married. He was given a new title, Count of Pulzig, but they lived a quiet, secluded life. Louise never recovered from the loss of her children. The pain of the separation was immense. Her health declined, and she died of cancer in 1831. She was only 30 years old. Prince Albert was just 12 when his mother died. He had not seen her since he was 5. This part of Prince Albert's life was systematically erased. When he married Queen Victoria, it was crucial to present him as a man of impeccable moral character. The story of his mother, a woman who had a love affair and was banished for it, was a deep embarrassment. It was a stain on the family's reputation. The official biographies of Albert barely mentioned his mother. If she was mentioned at all, it was as a tragic figure who died young. The reasons for her exile, the unhappy marriage, the affair, the cruel separation from her children were completely suppressed. Queen Victoria herself participated in this erasure. She was obsessed with creating a perfect family image. The story of Louise did not fit. She and Albert romanticized his childhood, creating a narrative of a perfect upbringing that ignored the trauma of his mother's absence. It was only much later that historians began to piece together the truth about Louise. Her story reveals the harsh reality for royal women in the 19th century. A husband's infidelity was tolerated, but a wife's was a crime punishable by exile and the loss of her own children. Her love affair didn't just cost her a title, it cost her everything. Number 17, did a queen's secret marriage threaten? The Tudor dynasty. She was the widow of a French king and the sister of the infamous King Henry V. She was a valuable political pawn, expected to marry whomever her brother chose. Instead, she followed her heart and secretly married a man for love, an act of defiance that could have cost them both their heads. Mary Tudor, not to be confused with her niece Bloody Mary, was known as one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe. In 1514, she was sent to France to marry the aging King Louis XX. She was 18, he was 52. The marriage was purely political, meant to secure an alliance. Mary agreed, but only on one condition: if she outlived the king, her brother Henry would allow her to marry whomever she chose next. Henry agreed. The marriage to Louis lasted less than 3 months. The old king died on January 1st, 1515. And Mary was now the Dowager Queen of France, young, beautiful, and, according to the agreement, free. But Henry V was not a man to keep his promises. A widowed queen was a huge asset on the European marriage market. He had no intention of letting her choose for herself. He sent his close friend, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, to France. His official job was to escort Mary back to England. His secret instructions were to prevent her from making any rash decisions. But there was a problem. Mary and Charles Brandon were already in love. They had developed a close relationship before she had left for France. Now, with her husband dead, they wanted to be together. They knew Henry would never approve. Brandon was not of royal blood. A marriage to him would be a political waste. Mary knew her brother. She knew he would break his promise and force her into another strategic marriage. So she and Charles made a bold and incredibly dangerous decision. They decided to marry in secret. In late February or early March 1515, in Paris, they were secretly wed. This was a direct act of defiance against the King of England. Marrying a member of the royal family without the monarch's consent was considered treason. When Henry V found out, he was enraged. His sister and his best friend had betrayed him. Some on his council called for Charles Brandon to be executed. The couple's future looked bleak, but Mary was Henry's favorite sister, and Charles Brandon was one of his few genuine friends. They wrote desperate letters to the king, begging for forgiveness. They also had a powerful ally in Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, who argued for leniency. In the end, Henry's affection for his sister won out. He agreed to forgive them, but at a steep price. They were forced to pay a massive fine, equivalent to millions of dollars today, effectively repaying her entire dowry from the French marriage. They were also forced to have a public wedding ceremony in England to legitimize their union. They were allowed to live, but their story was quickly pushed to the side. It was a royal scandal that highlighted the limits of Henry's power and the potential for personal feelings to disrupt political plans. Historians focused on Henry's great and public dramas and his break with Rome, his 6 wives. The story of his sister's secret love affair was a footnote. It showed a Tudor royal acting, not for power or politics, but for love. It was a dangerous precedent that the regime had no interest in celebrating. The love between Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon was real and lasting, and their granddaughter was Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. Their secret marriage, a moment of personal rebellion, had consequences that rippled through Tudor history. Number 16 was a Queen's secretary, her real partner. She was the tragic Queen of Scots, a woman who seemed to be ruled by her heart. Her marriage to the volatile Lord Darnley was a political nightmare, and her close friendship with her Italian private secretary fueled so much jealousy and suspicion that it ended in a brutal murder in front of her very eyes. Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to Scotland in 1561 after spending her youth in France. She was Catholic, beautiful, and charismatic, but she was a stranger in her own country, a land now dominated by stern Protestant lords. She needed allies and advisors she could trust. One of those people was David Rizzio. He was an Italian musician and singer from Piedmont who came to Scotland in the entourage of a diplomat. Mary was charmed by his wit, his musical talent, and his sophisticated European manners. In 1564, she appointed him as her private secretary for foreign correspondence, particularly with France. He was an outsider, with no loyalty to any of the feuding Scottish clans. This made him valuable to Mary. She came to rely on him completely. Their relationship became incredibly close. Rizzio was more than just a secretary. He was her confidant, her advisor, and her closest friend. They spent hours together, often late at night, playing music, speaking French and Italian, and discussing matters of state. The Protestant Scottish lords grew deeply suspicious. They saw Rizzio as a foreign agent, a papal spy, whispering Catholic poison into the Queen's ear. They resented his influence and his rapid rise from a humble musician to one of the most powerful men at court. The person who hated Rizzio the most was Mary's own husband, Lord Darnley. Mary had married him in 1565. The marriage was a disaster. Darnley was arrogant, violent, and desperate for power. He wanted to be a king, not just the Queen's husband. He became convinced that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair. He believed Rizzio was the reason Mary was denying him the crown matrimonial, which would have made him a co-sovereign. And his jealousy was stoked by the Protestant lords, who saw Darnley as a useful tool to get rid of Rizzio. Whether Mary and Rizzio were actually lovers is a question history cannot definitively answer. There is no proof. What is certain is that they shared a deep, intimate, emotional bond that excluded her husband. For Darnley and his co-conspirators, the perception of an affair was enough. On the night of March 9th, 1566, a group of lords, led by a desperate Darnley, stormed into the Queen's private chambers at the Palace of Holyrood House. Mary, who was 6 months pregnant, was having supper with Rizzio and a few ladies in waiting. The men dragged the screaming Rizzio from the Queen's presence. He clung to her skirts for protection, but they pulled him away and stabbed him over 50 times. His body was left in an antechamber. Mary was held at gunpoint during the ordeal. The murder was a brutal act of political terrorism designed to terrorize the Queen and seize control of the government. It was also an intensely personal act of jealousy. The story of the affair, true or not, served as the justification for the murder. It was used to portray Mary as an immoral queen under the spell of a foreign favorite, thus making the conspirators' actions seem necessary for the good of Scotland. While history often remembers the more famous scandals of Mary's life, like her marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who was accused of murdering Darnley, the story of David Rizzio is sometimes treated as a preamble to that larger drama, but the erasure is in the simplification. The deep personal connection Mary had with Rizzio, the trust she placed in him in a hostile court, is often reduced to a simple, unproven affair. The story was twisted by her enemies to justify their violence and discredit her rule, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout her tragic life. Number 15, did Spain's queen have a secret for every day of the week? She was a queen who ruled in her own right, but her personal life was so scandalous it threatened her throne. She was known to have a string of lovers so long that a popular court joke asked which officer was on duty that night. And her chaotic reign helped pave the way for a republic. Isabella II of Spain ascended to the throne as a child in 1833. Her reign was plagued by political instability, military coups, and civil wars. As a young woman, she was forced into a purely political marriage with her cousin, Francisco de Assis de Bourbon. It was a terrible match. Her husband was widely rumored to be homosexual and had no interest in his wife. Isabella was a woman with a strong appetite for life, love, and affection. Trapped in a sham marriage, she began to take lovers. And she was not discreet about it. Her affairs were an open secret and a constant source of political scandal. Unlike other queens who had one or two significant secret relationships, Isabella had many. Her lovers were often military officers, handsome politicians, or even singers. Each affair became entangled with the politics of the day. One of her most significant early lovers was General Francisco Serrano. He was a handsome and ambitious soldier who became her favorite. Their relationship gave him immense political influence. His rivals accused him of using the Queen's affection to advance his own career and the interests of his political faction. When one affair ended, another would begin. Captain Enrique Puigmalto was another lover, and he was widely believed to be the father of Isabella's son and heir, the future King Alfonso XII. This rumor of the heir's illegitimacy would haunt the Spanish monarchy for decades. The Queen's personal life became a weapon used by her enemies. Republicans who wanted to abolish the monarchy altogether used her behavior as proof of the crown's moral decay. The conservative Catholic factions were appalled by her conduct. Even the liberals, who sometimes benefited from her favor, were embarrassed. Her reign was a constant swirl of political intrigue and romantic drama. Ministers rose and fell based on their relationship with the Queen's current favorite. The situation came to a head in 1868. A coalition of military leaders and politicians, including her former lover General Serrano, led a revolution known as the Glorious Revolution. They issued a proclamation denouncing the Queen's immorality and tyranny. The military turned against her, and she was forced to flee the country into exile in Paris. The monarchy was overthrown, and a republic was eventually declared. Historians have often treated Isabella II with a mixture of pity and contempt. She is portrayed as a flighty, unintelligent woman ruled by her passions. Her reign is often seen as a failure. The erasure in her story is not of the affairs themselves, they were too public to ignore, but of the context. She was a woman placed in an impossible situation from childhood. She was a political pawn in a deeply divided country, forced into a loveless marriage, and denied any chance of a normal personal life. Her affairs were a form of rebellion and a search for affection, but they were also a product of the dysfunctional political system she inherited. It was convenient for the men who overthrew her to blame it all on her personal failings. By focusing on the immoral queen, they could justify their own ambition and legitimize their revolution. The story of her many lovers was used to erase the more complex political and social failures that led to the collapse of her reign. She was a scandalous queen, but she was also a scapegoat. Number 14, could a queen love her husband's greatest rival? She was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, queen of 2 countries, and mother to 2 kings. He was the most famous knight of his time, a man who served her, admired her, and was her husband's greatest political rival. The relationship between Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, is a story that has captivated people for centuries. It was the great love of the Virgin Queen's life, a bond so deep and so scandalous that it haunted her entire reign. Elizabeth and Robert Dudley had known each other since childhood. They were both imprisoned in the Tower of London by Queen Mary I. This shared experience of danger forged a powerful bond between them. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her first acts was to make Dudley her master of the horse. It was a position that kept him in constant close contact with her. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious, and Elizabeth was clearly besotted with him. They were inseparable. They hunted together, danced together, and spent countless hours in private conversation. Dudley was given apartments in the palace next to the Queen's. The court and all of Europe buzzed with rumors. Everyone assumed they were lovers. There was just one major problem: Robert Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived a quiet life in the countryside, away from the glittering court. She was an inconvenient obstacle to Dudley's ambition and seemingly to his relationship with the Queen. Then, in September 1560, tragedy struck. Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home. Her neck was broken. The official verdict was an accident, but no one believed it. The scandal was enormous. Had Dudley arranged his wife's murder so he would be free to marry the Queen? Was Elizabeth involved? The suspicion hung over them like a dark cloud. The Amy Robsart scandal made a marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley politically impossible. It would have confirmed everyone's worst fears and could have cost Elizabeth her throne. Despite this, their relationship continued for the rest of their lives. He remained her closest advisor and her eyes, as she affectionately called him. She never married, and many believe it was because she could not marry Dudley. He was the love of her life, but the one man she could never have as her husband. He eventually remarried in secret, which sent Elizabeth into a jealous rage. But even that could not break their bond. They remained deeply connected until his death in 1588. When Elizabeth died 15 years later, a letter from him, written just days before his death, was found in a small box by her bed. It was labeled his last letter. History did not so much erase this affair as it tried to sanitize it. Victorian historians in particular were uncomfortable with the idea of their great virgin queen being involved in such a passionate and scandalous relationship. They tried to portray her as a monarch who was above such human emotions, who sacrificed her personal happiness entirely for her country. They downplayed the intensity of her feelings for Dudley, recasting it as a platonic friendship. They emphasized her political calculations, arguing that she only kept Dudley around as a useful tool. But the personal letters, the constant rumors, and her lifelong devotion tell a different story. It was a complex relationship, a mix of love, friendship, and political partnership. To reduce it to a simple political alliance is to erase the very human heart of Queen Elizabeth. She was a powerful monarch, yes, but she was also a woman who loved a man. She could never marry, a love that defined her life and her reign. Number 13 was a queen's last hope, an enemy soldier. She was the doomed Queen of France, a symbol of royal excess. He was a handsome Swedish count, a soldier, and a diplomat. Their deep and passionate love affair was a secret that endured through the chaos of the French Revolution, and it fueled a desperate, failed attempt to save the royal family. Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess, was married to the future Louis XVI of France when she was just a teenager. Her life at the French court of Versailles was one of luxury and ceremony, but she was often lonely and unfulfilled. Her husband was a kind but shy and indecisive man, and their marriage was difficult for many years. In 1774, at a masked ball, she met Count Axel von Fersen. He was a Swedish aristocrat serving in the French army. He was handsome, intelligent, and worldly. There was an immediate connection between them. Fersen became a member of the Queen's intimate circle of friends. Whenever he was in Paris, he was a frequent visitor at her private palace, the Petit Trianon. Their relationship was a subject of gossip, but they were discreet. Fersen was fiercely loyal and devoted to the Queen. When the French Revolution began in 1789, the royal family's situation became increasingly dangerous. Fersen's love for the Queen transformed into a mission to save her. He became their most trusted secret agent, a vital link to the outside world. He wrote to her in code, organized escape plans, and tried to rally support from other European monarchs. The evidence of their love is found in their letters. Many were written in code or with invisible ink. For years, parts of their correspondence were censored, with sections blacked out by Fersen's family to protect the Queen's reputation. But recent scientific analysis has uncovered the hidden words. In one letter, Fersen wrote, "I love you and will love you madly all my life." In another, the Queen's own words, once hidden, read, "My dear friend, you whom I love and will love until the end." This was not just a friendship. It was a deep and committed love affair. Their love had its most dramatic moment in June 1791. Fersen was the mastermind behind the flight to Varanus, a detailed plan to smuggle the entire royal family out of Paris and to the safety of the Austrian border. He personally drove the carriage carrying the disguised king and queen out of the city. The plan almost succeeded, but a series of delays and mistakes led to the family being recognized and captured in the town of Varennes. They were brought back to Paris as prisoners. The failed escape sealed their fate. It was seen as proof of their treason. The king and queen were eventually put on trial and executed in 1793. Fersen was devastated. He spent the rest of his life trying to avenge their deaths and protect their memory. He never married. History has often been unkind to Marie Antoinette, portraying her as a frivolous, out-of-touch airhead. Her relationship with Fersen was often downplayed, especially by French historians, who preferred a narrative of a purely political revolution against a corrupt monarchy. It was easier to ignore the human drama, the story of a lonely queen who found love and loyalty in a foreign soldier. Admitting the depth of their relationship would have humanized her, made her more sympathetic. For her enemies and for later historians with a political agenda, it was better to keep her as a caricature of a bad queen. The censored letters and the downplayed romance were part of a long effort to erase the woman and leave only the myth. Number 12. Did a queen's gift to her servant hide a secret? She was the formidable Empress of India, the grieving widow who wore black for 40 years. He was a Scottish servant, a rugged man from the Highlands. Their unusually close friendship caused a massive scandal within the royal family and the government, a relationship so controversial that after her death, her children tried to burn every piece of evidence of it. Her Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861. She was shattered. She plunged into a deep state of mourning that lasted for the rest of her life. She withdrew from public view, and the court became a silent, somber place. In 1864, seeking solace, she began to spend more time at her remote Scottish estate, Balmoral. It was there that she grew close to a servant named John Brown. He had been a favorite groom of Prince Albert. He was blunt, plain-spoken, and treated the Queen not as a monarch, but as a person. He was not afraid to tell her what to think, to order her around for her own good. "Hoots, woman, yer shawl is askew," he might say. Victoria, tired of the fawning courtiers who walked on eggshells around her, found his honesty refreshing. Their relationship deepened. He became her faithful gillie, a Scottish attendant and her constant companion in Scotland. He took her on pony rides, managed her household, and provided the emotional support she desperately needed. She came to depend on him completely. She called him her dearest, best friend, but the rest of the royal household was horrified. Her children, her staff, and government ministers were appalled by the Queen's intimacy with a common servant. They thought it was undignified and scandalous. The gossip was relentless. People called her Merce Brown. There were rumors that they were secretly married. There is no proof of a physical affair or a secret marriage, but the emotional intimacy was undeniable. He was the only one who could lift her out of her depression. He encouraged her to return to her public duties. In many ways, he gave her back her life. Victoria, in turn, showered him with gifts and honors. She commissioned portraits and statues of him. Her devotion was absolute. When John Brown died in 1883, Victoria was once again heartbroken. Her grief was as intense as it had been for Albert. She wrote that her life seemed to be closing again. She published a tribute to him and planned to have a statue of him erected. Her family was furious. They saw it as a public declaration of an inappropriate relationship. After Victoria died in 1901, her children, led by her son, King Edward VII, moved quickly to erase John Brown from history. They went to Balmoral and burned all of his letters and diaries. They destroyed the statue of him and removed his portraits. They tried to pretend he had never existed. Their actions were a desperate attempt to protect the image of the monarchy. The story of Queen Victoria's deep love for a Scottish servant did not fit the myth of the stern, proper, imperial queen. It was too human, too messy, too scandalous. For decades, the story was suppressed. Biographers barely mentioned him. He was a footnote, an eccentric servant. It was only in the 20th century that historians began to uncover the true depth of their relationship. The erasure was almost complete, but the story was too powerful to stay buried. It reveals a hidden side of Victoria, a lonely, grieving woman who found comfort and companionship in the most unlikely of places. Number 11. Could a royal governess hold the Queen's heart? She was the last of the Stuart monarchs, a queen who presided over the union of England and Scotland to create Great Britain. Her reign was marked by political factions and war, but her personal life was dominated by an intense, passionate, and ultimately destructive relationship with her childhood friend and lady-in-waiting. Queen Anne had a life filled with tragedy. She suffered from poor health and endured at least 17 pregnancies, with none of her children surviving to adulthood. Her marriage to Prince George of Denmark was stable but not intellectually or emotionally fulfilling. The central relationship of her life was with Sarah Churchill, the beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious Duchess of Marlborough. They had known each other since they were children. Their bond was incredibly close. Anne was shy and insecure, and Sarah was confident and outspoken. Anne adored her. To dispense with the formality of their ranks, they gave each other nicknames. Anne was Mrs. Morley, and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. Their letters to each other are filled with passionate declarations of love and devotion. Anne wrote to Sarah, "I can't go to bed without seeing you. If I could be with you, I would be happy beyond expression." When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah's power reached its peak. She was made mistress of the robes and keeper of the privy purse. Her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, was the brilliant commander of the army. Together, the Churchills were the most powerful couple in the country, all because of Sarah's influence over the Queen. Sarah used her position to promote the Whig political party. For years, Anne did whatever her Miss Freeman told her to do. But Sarah's domineering personality began to wear on the Queen. She was often bossy and disrespectful. She would lecture Anne and argue with her in public. The Queen began to grow tired of being controlled. And a new person entered her life. Abigail Hill was a poor cousin of Sarah's, whom Sarah had placed in the Queen's household as a bedchamber woman. Abigail was quiet, gentle, and deferential. She offered the Queen the kindness and sympathy that Sarah no longer did. A new, intimate friendship began to form between Anne and Abigail. They would have quiet conversations late at night. Abigail was also related to the Tory politician Robert Harley, Sarah's political enemy. Abigail began to use her influence to promote the Tory cause. When Sarah found out about this new friendship, she was furious. She saw it as a betrayal. The rivalry between Sarah and Abigail became a battle for the Queen's heart and, by extension, for political control of the country. Sarah confronted the Queen, accusing her of having an unnatural dark passion for Abigail. This was a thinly veiled accusation of a lesbian relationship. Sarah's jealousy and anger boiled over. She tried to blackmail the queen by threatening to release her old love letters. This was the final straw. In 1711, the queen dismissed Sarah from all her positions at court. The break was complete and permanent. The two women who had loved each other for decades never spoke again. Historians have long debated the exact nature of Anne's relationships with Sarah and Abigail. Were they romantic friendships or something more? Regardless of the physical details, they were undoubtedly the most important emotional relationships of Anne's life. Later historians, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, were deeply uncomfortable with this. They tried to frame the story in purely political terms. It was a story of Whig versus Tory, with the women as mere players. They erased the intense personal drama and the passionate love that drove the Queen's decisions. They couldn't accept that the course of British politics could be changed by a Queen's broken heart. Number 10, did a second servant replace the first? She had already survived one major scandal over her relationship with a Scottish servant. In her old age, the widowed Queen Victoria, Empress of India, formed another equally controversial bond. This time, it was with a young Indian man who became her teacher, her confidant, and her munchie, a relationship that her court found even more shocking than the first. After John Brown's death in 1883, Queen Victoria was again lonely. In 1887, for her Golden Jubilee, 2 Indian men were sent to England to serve as royal attendants. One of them was a 24-year-old named Abdul Karim. He was tall, handsome, and dignified. The Queen, who was then 68, was immediately taken with him. She asked him to teach her Hindustani Urdu. Their daily lessons became the highlight of her day. He told her about his life, about Indian culture, food, and religion. Victoria, who had never been to India despite being its empress, was fascinated. She promoted him rapidly. He was no longer a servant, but her munchie, or teacher. He was given a private secretary status, comfortable rooms, and a staff of his own. He became a constant presence by the Queen's side. The royal household erupted in protest. They had barely tolerated John Brown, a Scotsman. They were absolutely incensed by the influence of an Indian commoner. They saw Karim as a social climbing charlatan who was manipulating the elderly queen for his own gain. There was also a strong element of racial prejudice. They were horrified that an Indian man was being treated as an equal, dining with the family and advising the Empress of India. Victoria would not hear a word against him. She saw the court's hostility as jealousy and prejudice. She defended him fiercely. She called him her dearest Munshi, and signed her letters to him as your loving mother. She took him on her travels across Europe. She had his portrait painted. She gave him land grants in India. Her devotion was total. For the Queen, Karim filled a void. He was a connection to the vast empire she ruled but did not know. He was a friend who was not part of the stuffy, judgmental court. He treated her with a warmth and affection that she craved. The nature of their relationship was one of deep affection and maternal love on her part, and respectful devotion on his. But the court saw it as something sinister. They constantly plotted against him, trying to find evidence of wrongdoing to get him sent back to India. They spied on him. They complained to the Queen, which only made her more stubborn. The conflict over the munchie caused a deep rift between Victoria and her children and staff. When Victoria died in 1901, the retribution was swift and brutal, just as it had been with John Brown. Her son, now King Edward VII, and her daughter Beatrice ordered a raid on the Munchi's house. They seized all the letters the Queen had written to him and burned them in a bonfire at Windsor Castle. They were determined to wipe out all evidence of the relationship. Abdul Karim was summarily dismissed from his position and sent back to India. He was ordered never to speak of his time with the Queen. He died just a few years later, a forgotten man. The erasure was intentional and thorough. For almost a century, Abdul Karim was almost completely written out of the story of Queen Victoria's reign. He was a non-person. It was only in 2010 that a historian discovered his surviving diaries, which he had kept in secret. These journals, along with a few surviving records, finally brought the story of their remarkable friendship to light. It revealed not only a hidden chapter of Victoria's life, but also the deep-seated prejudice at the heart of the British Empire. Number 9 was a queen's lover, a political genius, or just a good dancer. She was the powerful Queen of Castile, the monarch who unified Spain and funded Christopher Columbus. Her public image was one of pious, sober devotion to her husband, King Ferdinand, but behind the scenes there were persistent whispers of her special favor for a brilliant and dashing military commander. Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon are remembered as one of history's great royal partnerships. Their marriage in 1469 united the two largest kingdoms in Spain and laid the foundation for the modern nation. They were known as the Catholic monarchs. Isabella was the dominant partner, a shrewd and determined ruler. Ferdinand was a capable military leader and diplomat. Their marriage was primarily a political alliance. While they had a working relationship and produced several children, it was not always a close personal one. Ferdinand was known to have had several affairs. Isabella, on the other hand, maintained a public reputation for impeccable virtue. But there was one man whose name was consistently linked with hers in a way that went beyond professional duty, Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, known as El Gran Capitán, the Great Captain. De Córdoba was a military genius. He rose through the ranks during the Long War to reconquer Granada from the Moors. He was brave, charismatic, and fiercely loyal to Isabella. She recognized his talent early on and became his most important patron. She entrusted him with her most critical military campaigns. He never failed her. He was a master of strategy and logistics, and his victories were crucial to the unification of Spain. Their relationship was intensely close. Isabella clearly admired him not just as a general but as a man. He was everything. Her husband was not dashing, chivalrous, and utterly devoted to her service. Court gossip noted the queen's special affection for her great captain. When he was at court, he was a constant presence by her side. When he was on campaign, they exchanged frequent letters. His loyalty was to her first and to Spain second. There is no concrete proof of a physical affair. To suggest such a thing about the pious Queen Isabella would have been treasonous. But the emotional bond and the political trust were undeniable. Ferdinand was said to be jealous of the Queen's reliance on and favoritism toward de Córdoba. After Isabella's death in 1504, Ferdinand's attitude toward the great captain cooled considerably. He recalled de Córdoba from his command in Italy and effectively forced him into retirement. With his patron and protector gone, the general's career was over. The erasure of this relationship was part of the construction of Isabella's historical image. She needed to be seen as a saintly, almost superhuman figure. The Catholic queen could have no personal frailties or romantic attachments outside her marriage. Her relationship with de Córdoba had to be framed as purely professional, the wise queen recognizing the talented general. To suggest a deeper personal affection would be to tarnish the legend. So, the story was simplified. She became the pious queen, and he became her loyal soldier. The human element, the admiration, the trust, the potential for a deeper emotional connection between a powerful woman and the charismatic man who served her was carefully scrubbed from the official narrative. The whispers of the court were silenced by the grand official histories that preferred a simple icon to a complex woman. On number 8, who was the true king of France, the king or the cardinal? She was the Queen Regent of France, the mother of the famous Sun King, Louis XIV. He was an Italian cardinal, her chief minister and her predecessor's protege. Their partnership was so close, so intimate, and so powerful that many believed they were secretly married, and that he, not the king, was the true ruler of France. Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess, was married to King Louis XI of France. Their marriage was cold and unhappy for decades. They lived largely separate lives, but late in their marriage, they surprisingly produced 2 sons, the future Louis XIV and his brother Philippe. When Louis XI died in 1643, his son was only 4 years old. Anne became the Queen Regent, the ruler of France until her son came of age. She needed a chief minister she could trust. She chose Cardinal Jules Mazarin. He had been groomed for power, by the previous chief minister, the formidable Cardinal Richelieu. Mazarin was a brilliant diplomat and a cunning politician. He was also charming and handsome. He and Anne quickly formed an unbreakable bond. They were a perfect team. She had the royal authority, he had the political skill. Together they ruled France. Their relationship was the subject of intense speculation. They worked together constantly, often meeting late into the night. Their letters to each other, though discreet, reveal a deep and tender affection. He was her dearest friend, her rock. She was the center of his world. The rest of the French nobility hated Mazarin. They saw him as a greedy, power-hungry foreigner. They resented his control over the queen and the government. This resentment boiled over into a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. During the Fronde, the rebels produced a flood of pamphlets and political cartoons attacking the queen and her cardinal. A common theme was that they were lovers. They were mocked and vilified. The attacks were vicious and personal, but they did not break the bond between Anne and Mazarin. If anything, the shared danger brought them closer. They eventually crushed the rebellions, and their power was more secure than ever. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is, were they secretly married? A marriage between them would have been valid in the eyes of the church, as Mazarin was a cardinal but not an ordained priest. A secret marriage would explain the depth of their commitment and why they never parted, even under extreme pressure. There is no marriage certificate, but the circumstantial evidence is strong. After Mazarin's death, a pouch was found around Louis XIV's neck containing what was believed to be a written promise from his mother that she had never married the cardinal. The fact that such a denial was deemed necessary suggests how widespread the belief was. Whether they were lovers or secretly married, their partnership was the central fact of French politics for nearly 2 decades. But history, especially official French history, has often tried to tidy up this story. It focuses on the young Louis XIV, waiting in the wings to become the great Sun King. Anne is portrayed as the dutiful regent, and Mazarin as the clever but temporary minister. Their intensely personal relationship is often downplayed. It was an inconveniently messy human story at the beginning of a glorious reign. It was easier to present a narrative of smooth, legitimate succession than one of a queen regent and her Italian cardinal partner, who may have been much more than just political allies. Number 7. Did an empress buy her lovers with power and palaces? She was one of the most powerful women in history, the Empress of all the Russias. Her name is synonymous with power, expansion, and the golden age of the Russian Empire. But she was also a woman of immense passion, whose series of lovers, or favorites, were not just personal companions, but key figures in her government. Catherine the Great's relationship with Grigori Potemkin is famous, but he was just one of many. What is less known is the systematic way she managed her love life and how her first great love affair put her on the throne. Catherine came to Russia as a young German princess, Sophie, to marry the heir, the future Peter III. The marriage was a disaster. Peter was unstable and cruel. Catherine was intelligent, ambitious, and trapped. She knew that to survive, she needed to build her own power base, and she needed allies. She found her first major ally and lover in a handsome young officer of the Imperial Guard named Grigori Orlov. Orlov and his 4 brothers were influential figures in the military. Catherine and Grigori began a passionate affair. It was a relationship of both love and political calculation. When Peter III became emperor in 1762, his erratic behavior alienated the military and the church. He threatened to divorce Catherine and lock her away. Catherine and the Orlov brothers knew they had to act. They staged a coup d'etat. With the backing of the guards, they arrested Peter and proclaimed Catherine the sole ruler of Russia. A few days later, Peter was killed, likely by one of the Orlov brothers. Grigori Orlov was now the lover of the Empress. He was showered with titles, wealth, and power. He wanted to marry Catherine, but she refused. She knew that marrying him would diminish her own authority. She had not overthrown one husband just to become subservient to another. Their passionate affair lasted for over a decade, and they had a son together. But eventually, Catherine grew tired of his infidelities and his lack of political sophistication. After Orlov came a succession of other favorites. When one lover fell out of favor, he was usually dismissed with a generous pension and a large estate. A new, often younger man would be tested by one of Catherine's trusted ladies in waiting before being presented to the Empress. This system, while scandalous, was also a way for Catherine to maintain control. Her lovers were her creatures. Their power and wealth came from her and could be taken away by her. They were a part of her political system. The most significant of these was Grigori Potemkin. Their intense affair was short, but their political partnership and deep friendship lasted for the rest of their lives. Even after they were no longer lovers, he often helped her choose his successors. The story of Catherine's many lovers was used against her by her enemies. She was portrayed as a depraved, immoral woman. Vicious rumors, like the infamous and completely false story about her and a horse, were created to discredit her. Later, especially in the 19th century, historians tried to either ignore her personal life or condemn it. They struggled to reconcile the image of a great and powerful ruler with that of a woman who had a series of open love affairs. The erasure was an attempt to separate the great Empress from the passionate woman. They failed to see that the two were inseparable. Her ability to use personal relationships for political gain was part of her genius. Her first love affair put her on the throne. The subsequent ones were part of how she ruled it. To sanitize her story is to misunderstand the source of her power. Number 6 was the Queen's servant, an Italian spy. She was the spurned and ridiculed wife of a British king. She spent years wandering Europe while her husband tried to divorce her. And her incredibly close relationship with a handsome Italian servant of humble origins created a scandal so enormous it led to a public trial in the House of Lords. Caroline of Brunswick was married to the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, in 1795. He detested her from the moment he saw her. They separated after the birth of their only child, Princess Charlotte, a year later. Caroline was cast aside, living a restricted life in England. Tired of her situation, she left for Europe in 1814. She traveled extravagantly, gathering a large and eclectic entourage around her. In Italy, she hired a man named Bartolomeo Pergami. He was a former soldier, tall and charismatic. He started as a courier, but was rapidly promoted. He became her head of household, her financial manager, and her constant companion. She showered him with gifts and titles. She even bought an estate for him in Italy. Their relationship was flagrantly intimate. They were seen dining together, walking arm in arm, and he had a room next to hers wherever they traveled. They were inseparable. Rumors flew back to England. Caroline's husband, now King George IV, was desperate to divorce her. He saw her behavior with Pergami as his golden opportunity. He set up a secret commission to travel through Europe and collect evidence of Caroline's adultery. They interviewed disgruntled former servants and paid for testimony. In 1820, George IV ascended to the throne. Caroline, to his horror, decided to return to England to claim her rights as queen. The king responded by introducing a bill in Parliament, the Pains and Penalties Bill, which would grant him a divorce and strip Caroline of her title. This led to a sensational public trial in the House of Lords. The king's lawyers presented their evidence, painting a sordid picture of the queen's life with Pergami. Italian witnesses described seeing them in states of undress and acting with indecent familiarity. The whole country was gripped by the scandal, but the public sided with Caroline. They saw her not as an adulterous queen, but as a wronged wife, persecuted by a deeply unpopular and immoral king. She became a symbol of defiance against a corrupt establishment. The trial became a political circus. In the end, the government, fearing a popular uprising, withdrew the bill. Caroline had won. She was still the queen. But it was hollow victory. She was barred from her husband's coronation and died just a few weeks later. The story of Caroline and Pergami has often been treated as a farcical sideshow in British history. She is portrayed as a foolish, vulgar woman, and he as a cunning opportunist. The erasure is of the human reality behind the scandal. Caroline was a deeply lonely woman, publicly rejected and humiliated by her husband. In Pergami, she seems to have found companionship, loyalty, and perhaps love. Their relationship may have been unwise and scandalous, but it was also a response to the cruelty of her situation. It was convenient for the establishment to frame the story as one of a ridiculous queen and her scheming Italian lover. This narrative distracted from the real issues, the king's own appalling behavior, and the legitimate grievances of a woman who had been terribly mistreated. The affair, real or not, was the excuse, not the cause, of her persecution. Number 5. Did a poet's love cost him his head? She was the 5th wife of Henry V, a young and vibrant queen married to an aging, obese, and unwell king. Her youthful spirits and a lingering love for a man from her past led to a tragic affair that was brutally exposed, costing her, her lover, and their confidants their lives. Catherine Howard came to the Tudor court as a teenager. She was a niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. She caught the eye of King Henry V shortly after he had annulled his marriage to his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, and Henry was captivated by Catherine's youth and high spirits. He called her his rose without a thorn. They were married in 1540. She was about 19. He was 49. Catherine was a queen, but she was also a young woman with a past. Before she came to court, while living in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, she had been involved with a man named Francis Dereham. She had also had a flirtatious relationship with her music teacher. When she became queen, she made a foolish mistake. She brought people from her past into her new royal household. She made Francis Dereham her private secretary. Worse, she began a secret relationship with a man at court named Thomas Culpeper. He was a handsome and charming gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a favorite of Henry's. Catherine and Culpeper began to meet in secret, aided by one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. And they exchanged letters and gifts. One of Catherine's letters to Culpeper survived. In it she wrote, "I die when you send me no news of yourself, yours as long as life lasts, Catherine." The affair was incredibly reckless. The court was a nest of spies and rivals. In late 1841, a man who knew about Catherine's past life came forward. An investigation was launched by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. The story began to unravel. They interrogated servants and members of her household. Francis Dereham confessed to his prior relationship with Catherine. Lady Rochford, under pressure, confessed to arranging the secret meetings between the Queen and Thomas Culpeper. When Henry was told, he was devastated. His rose without a thorn was tainted. He had been made a fool. His reaction was swift and merciless. Culpeper and Dereham were arrested and charged with treason. They were both executed in December 1541. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen and imprisoned. A bill of attainder was passed in Parliament, condemning her to death without a formal trial. In February 1542, Catherine Howard, along with Lady Rochford, was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was barely 21 years old. The story of Catherine Howard is often told as a simple tale of a foolish, immoral girl who paid the ultimate price. The erasure is of her humanity and her impossible situation. She was a teenager thrust into a marriage with a dangerous and unpredictable man almost 3 times her age. She was likely terrified and lonely. She sought comfort and affection with a man closer to her own age. Her actions were not those of a cunning political plotter, but of a naive and frightened young woman. In history, written by the victors of the Tudor court, needed to justify the king's brutal actions. So Catherine was painted as a wanton woman who got what she deserved. Her story became a cautionary tale, a footnote in the grand drama of Henry V's reign. The tragic reality of a young life destroyed by the lethal politics of the Tudor court was simplified into a morality play, erasing the terrified girl at its center. Number 4, did a handsome soldier steal an empress's heart? She was the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Empress of the French. While her husband was away conquering Egypt, she was at home in Paris, falling in love with a handsome young army officer, an affair that nearly ended her marriage and changed the course of her life. Josephine de Beauharnais married Napoleon Bonaparte in 1796. It was a passionate match, at least on his side. He was madly in love with her. She, a sophisticated older widow, was initially less enthusiastic, marrying him for security. While Napoleon was away on his first Italian campaign, he wrote her a stream of fiery, passionate letters. She rarely answered. In 1798, Napoleon launched his ambitious campaign in Egypt. He was gone for over a year. During this long absence, Josephine began an affair with a man named Hippolyte Charles. He was a lieutenant in a hussar regiment, 9 years younger than her. He was known for being charming, witty, and exceptionally good-looking. He was the complete opposite of the intense, work-obsessed Napoleon. With Charles, Josephine found fun, lightness, and affection. Their affair was not very discreet. They were seen together in Paris. She even bought a country estate, Malmaison, where they spent a great deal of time. The affair became common knowledge among Paris society and, crucially, among Napoleon's own family, who already disliked Josephine. Napoleon, isolated in Egypt, was one of the last to know. The British, who were blockading the Mediterranean, intercepted a letter from one of Napoleon's aides to his brother, describing the affair in detail. With malicious delight, they published it in their newspapers. That is how Napoleon found out about his wife's infidelity. He was publicly humiliated and privately enraged. He wrote a furious letter to his brother, saying, "The veil has been torn. I am tired of human nature." He vowed to divorce her as soon as he returned. When he finally landed back in France in 1799, he went straight to their home and refused to see her. He locked himself in his room. Josephine was terrified. She realized she had misjudged him completely. She had not understood the depth of his love or the force of his anger. She stood outside his door for hours, weeping and begging for forgiveness, with her 2 children, Eugene and Hortense, joining her. Finally, Napoleon relented. He opened the door. He agreed to forgive her, largely for the sake of her children, whom he adored. He forgave her, but he never forgot. The dynamic of their marriage changed forever. The passionate, almost worshipful love he had for her was gone, replaced by a more sober, controlled affection. He began to take mistresses of his own. The affair with Hippolyte Charles marked the end of the first romantic phase of their relationship. Josephine, for her part, seems to have been genuinely remorseful and became a devoted and loyal wife from that point on. But years later, when Napoleon decided he needed an heir that Josephine could not give him, he divorced her. The memory of her past infidelity may have made that decision easier. Historians often focus on Napoleon's rise to power, his battles, and his eventual divorce from Josephine because she was barren. The affair with Hippolyte Charles is sometimes treated as a minor domestic drama, but it was a pivotal moment. It fundamentally changed the most important personal relationship of Napoleon's life. The story was downplayed because it didn't fit the grand, epic narrative of the great man. It was a moment of deep personal pain and public humiliation. It showed the master of Europe as a vulnerable, heartbroken husband, a side of him that the legend makers preferred to erase. Number 3, did a queen's murderous affair destroy her kingdom? She was a queen of Naples who lived a life of such scandal, violence, and political intrigue that it reads like a sensational drama. Her series of marriages and reputed love affairs destabilized her kingdom and led to her eventual downfall and mysterious death. Joanna I of Naples ruled in the 14th century, a time of great turmoil. She became queen as a teenager in 1343. Her first husband was her cousin, Andrew of Hungary. It was a politically arranged and deeply unhappy marriage. Andrew was ambitious and wanted to rule as king, not just as the queen's consort. The Neapolitan court was split into factions. In 1345, Andrew was murdered. He was thrown from a balcony at a castle outside Naples. Joanna was immediately suspected of having a hand in the plot. The suspicion was that she had conspired with her lover, another of her cousins, Louis of Taranto. The murder caused a massive scandal throughout Europe. Andrew's brother, the King of Hungary, invaded Naples to avenge his death, forcing Joanna to flee. Joanna eventually stood trial before the Pope in Avignon and was acquitted, but the shadow of the murder never left her. She did marry Louis of Taranto, which only confirmed the suspicions of many. Her reign was a constant struggle to maintain control of her kingdom. She outlived Louis and married two more times. Her third husband was James IV of Majorca, and her fourth was Otto of Brunswick. Throughout her life, she was accused of having numerous lovers and of using her relationships for political ends. Her story is a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and family feuds. She was a woman trying to rule in her own right in a world dominated by powerful men who wanted her throne. Her personal life was her greatest vulnerability. Every relationship was scrutinized, every friendship interpreted as a potential conspiracy. Whether she was a ruthless killer who murdered her husband to be with her lover, or a victim of circumstance framed by her enemies, is a question historians still debate. The most likely truth is somewhere in the middle. She was a ruler who made ruthless decisions to survive. The affair with Louis of Taranto was probably both a personal passion and a political alliance against her unwanted husband. But the narrative that solidified was the one pushed by her enemies, that of the evil, lustful queen. This version of the story was used to justify the political attacks against her. In the end, she was overthrown by another cousin, Charles of Durazzo. He imprisoned her in a remote castle where she died in 1382, likely smothered with a pillow. The erasure in Joanna's story is the nuance. She was flattened into a one-dimensional villain. The complexities of her political situation, the constant threat of invasion, the warring factions within her own court, the challenges of being a female ruler were ignored. It was easier to blame everything on her supposed sexual depravity. The story of the murderous love affair became the only story, a simple and sensational tale that completely obscured the capable, if ruthless, queen who managed to hold onto a difficult throne for nearly 40 years. Number 2 was a queen's lover discovered hiding in a wardrobe. She was a young German princess, married into the British royal family. He was a handsome Swedish count. Their tragic love affair was discovered, leading to his mysterious death and her imprisonment for the rest of her life in a remote German castle. This is the story of Sophie Dorothea of Celle, the wife of the future King George I of Great Britain. In 1682, Sophie Dorothea was married to her cousin, George Louis of Hanover. It was a miserable, loveless match arranged for dynastic reasons. Old George was cold and dull, and he openly kept a mistress. Sophie Dorothea was lively, intelligent, and desperately unhappy. She found solace in a relationship with Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. He was a Swedish soldier of fortune serving in the Hanoverian army. He was dashing, romantic, and had known Sophie since they were children. They began a secret and passionate correspondence. Hundreds of their letters survive, filled with declarations of love and plans for a future together. They called each other by pet names and used lemon juice as invisible ink to hide their most secret messages. They managed to carry on their secret affair for several years, meeting in secret in Sophie's apartments. But the court was a dangerous place, full of spies. A jealous countess, who also had feelings for Königsmarck, discovered their letters and exposed the affair to Sophie's father-in-law, the Elector Ernest Augustus. The trap was set. On the night of July 1st, 1694, Königsmarck went to Sophie's rooms for what he believed was a final secret meeting before they planned to run away together. He was never seen again. The most widely accepted story is that he was ambushed by 4 of the Elector's guards as he was leaving the palace. He was killed and his body was disposed of, likely weighted down and thrown into the local river. No trace of him was ever found. Sophie Dorothea's fate was sealed. She was divorced from her husband, stripped of her titles, and separated from her 2 children, the future King George II of Great Britain and the future Queen of Prussia. She was imprisoned in the castle of Ahlden in her home duchy of Celle. She remained a prisoner there for over 30 years, until her death in 1726. She was never allowed to see her children again. She was known as the Princess of Ahlden. The Hanoverian court did everything it could to erase the story. It was a massive scandal that threatened the reputation of the family just as they were about to inherit the British throne. All official records of the affair and the murder were destroyed. It was forbidden to speak of Königsmarck or the imprisoned princess. Sophie Dorothea became a non-person. Her son, George II, who loved his mother, hated his father for what he had done. When he became king, he tried to have her released, but it was too late. The story of the tragic lovers of Hanover was suppressed for generations. It was a dark family secret. It was only much later, when their secret letters were discovered and published, that the full story of their love and the court's brutal reaction came to light. It was a story the British monarchy very much wanted history to forget. Number one, what secret did the Virgin Queen take to her grave? She was the first Queen of England to rule in her own right, a Protestant icon who defied the Pope and the Spanish Armada. Her childhood was marked by terror and uncertainty, and a scandalous secret affair in her youth with a man who married her father's widow may have been the reason she vowed never to marry. Before she was Queen Elizabeth I, she was the teenage Princess Elizabeth, the forgotten daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. After her father, Henry V, died in 1547, the throne passed to her younger half-brother, Edward VI. Elizabeth, then 14, went to live with her stepmother, Henry's widow, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr soon remarried in a secret love match to a man named Thomas Seymour. He was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour and the uncle of the young king. He was ambitious, charming, and reckless. With Elizabeth living under his roof, he began to pay her an inappropriate amount of attention. Seymour would come into her bedroom in the mornings while she was still in her nightgown and engage in rough horseplay. He would tickle her, slap her on the backside, and flirt with her relentlessly. At first, Catherine Parr seems to have treated it as a joke, even joining in. But as Elizabeth blossomed into a young woman, Seymour's behavior became more serious, and Catherine's attitude changed to jealousy. There were rumors that Seymour wanted to marry Elizabeth. He saw her as his path to power. One day, Catherine reportedly found Elizabeth and Seymour in an embrace. Soon after, Elizabeth was sent away from the household. The situation had become too dangerous. After Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, Thomas Seymour's ambition ran wild. He openly plotted to marry Elizabeth and overthrow his brother, who was the Lord Protector of the realm. His plans were discovered. He was arrested and charged with treason. A key part of the investigation was his relationship with Princess Elizabeth. She was interrogated relentlessly. Had she encouraged him? Had she agreed to marry him? Had their relationship become physical? The 15-year-old princess handled the interrogation with a skill and cunning that foreshadowed the great queen she would become. She admitted to the flirtatious behavior, but denied any treasonous plot. She kept her composure and implicated no one. Her clever answers saved her life. Thomas Seymour was not so lucky. He was executed for treason in 1549. This episode had a profound and lasting impact on Elizabeth. It was her first harsh lesson in the dangerous intersection of love, sex, and politics. She had seen how a personal relationship could be twisted into a treasonous plot, how her own body could be seen as a political prize. The scandal was deeply humiliating and terrifying. She had narrowly escaped with her life. Many historians believe this traumatic experience was a key reason why she chose to remain the Virgin Queen. She had learned early on that marriage and personal intimacy were a trap, a way for ambitious men to control her and threaten her power. The story of Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour was a scandal the Tudor establishment desperately wanted to bury. It was an ugly story about the sexual exploitation of a young princess by her ambitious guardian. Official accounts of Seymour's downfall focused on his political treason, downplaying the personal, scandalous details involving the future queen. It was a chapter of her life that was actively suppressed, but it may hold the key to understanding the central mystery of her reign, why the powerful queen who had a line of suitors from across Europe chose, in the end, to rule alone. The secret she took to her grave might have been a decision made in her youth, never again to let a man have that kind of power over her.